The Battle of Imphal, fought between March and July 1944 in the rugged frontier between India and Burma, stands as one of the most decisive and grueling campaigns of the Second World War, a clash that not only shaped the fate of Southeast Asia, but also shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility forever. At its core, the battle represented two opposite visions of warfare colliding on a battlefield defined by impossible terrain, monsoon rains, and the unforgiving realities of jungle combat. For the Japanese Empire, the offensive into India, codenamed Operation Yugo, was conceived as a bold gamble, a desperate but ambitious attempt to reverse their strategic decline after years of attrition across the Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters. Their aim was nothing less than to break British power in the region by capturing Imphal and advancing into the plains of Assam, where they hoped to seize Allied supply bases, spark rebellion within British-ruled India, and forge a wider Asian uprising that would transform the war in their favor. Led by the fervent and uncompromising Lieutenant General Renya Mudaguchi, Japanese troops embarked on an audacious march through some of the harshest terrain on Earth, carrying minimal supplies and relying on the belief that speed, surprise, and spiritual resolve would deliver them victory. On the Allied side, under the steady leadership of General William Slim and the British 14th Army, the battle unfolded as a dramatic test of resilience, ingenuity, and adaptation. Having suffered devastating defeats in Malaya, Singapore, and Burma earlier in the war, the British Indian Army had transformed itself into a disciplined, well-trained, and increasingly modern fighting force. Imphal had been fortified as a critical logistical base, stocked with vast reserves of food, ammunition, and fuel, and, most importantly, secured by overwhelming Allied air superiority, which would eventually prove the decisive factor in sustaining the besieged troops and outlasting the Japanese offensive. As the Japanese divisions pushed through the mountains in early 1944, their initial advances surprised and alarmed the Allies, forcing rapid withdrawals, fierce defensive battles, and a tense fight to prevent encirclement. The Japanese appeared unstoppable at first, executing daring nighttime assaults, cutting roads, ambushing convoys, and isolating garrisons across the frontier. Yet beneath this early momentum lay a fatal weakness. Their entire offensive depended on capturing Allied supply dumps because their own logistical system had reached its breaking point. Once their advance stalled in the shadow of Imphal, the harsh reality of starvation, disease, and overextension began to unravel the Japanese war machine. The battle quickly transformed from a bold offensive into a catastrophic siege, with Japanese troops attempting to strangle Imphal while themselves growing weaker day by day. The Allies, supplied entirely by air, not only held their ground but also gradually turned the tide through counterattacks supported by artillery, armor, and relentless air power. The fighting across the surrounding hills, at places such as Nungshagum, Shenam Saddle, and the Tadim Road, became some of the fiercest of the war, characterized by hand-to-hand combat, suicidal charges, and unimaginable hardship on both sides. Meanwhile, to the north at Kohima, a parallel struggle helped determine the outcome by blocking Japanese reinforcements and preventing the strategic link between the Imphal and Dimapur fronts. The reopening of the Imphal-Kohima Road in June 1944 marked the symbolic and practical collapse of the Japanese siege, after which General Slim's decision to pursue the retreating enemy transformed defeat into annihilation. The Japanese retreat, conducted through monsoon-soaked mountains with no food, no medicine, and no hope of reinforcement, became one of the most tragic and devastating withdrawals in military history. Tens of thousands perished from starvation, disease, or exhaustion before ever reaching their bases in Burma, and the once formidable Japanese divisions were reduced to hollow remnants incapable of further large-scale operations. The Battle of Imphal thus not only saved India from invasion, but also permanently broke the offensive power of the Japanese army in Southeast Asia. In its aftermath, the Allies gained the momentum needed to launch their victorious Burma campaign, eventually recapturing Rangoon and severing Japan's access to vital territories and resources. For Japan, the battle's failure exposed the fatal flaws of a strategy built on overconfidence, spiritual rhetoric, and disregard for logistical limits. For the Allies, particularly the Indian Army, it became a symbol of redemption and transformation, demonstrating the growing professionalism, cooperation, and resilience of a force that had once suffered humiliating defeats. The road to Imphal was paved not only with military ambition, but with the heavy weight of strategic desperation that defined the Japanese Empire by early 1944. After years of pushing the boundaries of their conquests across Southeast Asia, the Japanese command found itself facing the undeniable truth that the tide of the war was shifting. The loss of Guadalcanal, the grinding campaigns in New Guinea, and the increasing pressure from the United States Pacific Fleet left Japan looking for a decisive victory, one that could halt the momentum of the Allies and restore initiative to the Imperial Army. Burma, with its unforgiving jungles and precarious logistics, became the centerpiece of a bold and desperate plan. The Japanese believed that by cutting into India, striking hard at Imphal and Dimapur, and severing Allied supply lines, they could destabilize British power in the region. Their vision extended beyond the battlefield. They hoped to spark rebellion among Indian nationalists, destabilize the Raj, and ultimately flip India from a colonial possession into an ally. This was not merely a military gamble, it was a geopolitical gamble of enormous scale, one that required flawless execution, perfect timing, and an unshakable belief in the superiority of Japanese morale over material. At the heart of this operation was Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, a fervent believer in the offensive spirit of the Japanese soldier. Charismatic, stubborn, and convinced that the spirit of Bushido could overcome any obstacle, Mutaguchi envisioned an attack that would slice through the British defenses, capture the vital supply bases in Imphal, and roll on toward the Assamese plains. To him, the march into India was not madness, it was destiny. Yet beneath the confidence lay uncomfortable realities. Japanese supply lines in Burma were stretched thin, dependent on unreliable pack animals and human porters. Disease, exhaustion, and malnutrition had already taken a toll on many units. And while Mutaguchi dreamed of triumph, others in his command whispered doubts. They knew the terrain, the monsoon, and the logistical limitations posed dangers even greater than Allied bullets. But the die had been cast, and the Japanese 15th Army marched toward what would become one of the most brutal battlefield confrontations of the Second World War. The origins of the Imphal campaign can be traced back to the shifting dynamics of power in Southeast Asia after the Allied reoccupation of the Arakan coast and steady advances in the Pacific. With each passing month, Japanese strategists saw their perimeter contracting. Against this backdrop, Mutaguchi's Operation Ugo emerged as a bold answer to a deteriorating situation. Unlike previous defensive-minded strategies, Operation Ugo envisioned a massive offensive that defied Japanese logistical doctrine. Instead of shortening supply lines, the Japanese 15th Army would extend them deep into enemy-held territory, relying on the rapid collapse of British defenses and the seizure of Allied food and fuel dumps. Such a gamble was rooted in earlier Japanese battlefield successes, where rapid advances had paralyzed opponents before they could marshal a coherent response. Burma, however, was not Malaya, and 1941 was not 1941. The British Indian Army had learned from its past failures. Hard lessons from the collapse of Malaya and Singapore led to sweeping reforms, improved jungle warfare training, and a growing reliance on combined arms tactics supported by air power. Meanwhile, the arrival of the American-trained Chinese divisions and the expanding influence of General William Slim brought a sense of renewed purpose to the Allied forces. Still, the Japanese High Command clung to its belief that the British Indian forces were brittle, lacking the resolve to hold against an all-out assault. Reinforced by the idea that Indian morale was fragile and that nationalist sympathies could be weaponized, Mutaguchi marketed his India invasion as not only feasible but inevitable. The triumphalist narratives he painted to Tokyo, however, glossed over the enormous human cost the advance would require. Japanese units would traverse mountains, cross rivers, and march through some of the densest jungles in Asia, all while carrying limited supplies. Mutaguchi dismissed these concerns with a wave of his hand, insisting that victory would bring bounty. But in war, hope is not a supply line, and belief cannot fill an empty stomach. The road to Imphal thus began not with well-calculated logistics, but with a dangerous blend of ambition, pride, and illusion. As the Japanese prepared to move toward India, the British and Allied leadership in India and Burma watched developments with increasing concern. Intelligence reports indicated heightened Japanese troop movements, though the exact nature and timing of the offensive remained clouded in uncertainty. General Slim, commander of the British 14th Army, had long anticipated that Japan might attempt a major thrust toward Imphal or Kohima. His strategy, however, didn't hinge on merely predicting Japanese intentions. It relied on flexibility, mobility, and the ability to exploit the Japanese army's biggest weakness, logistics. Slim believed that if the Japanese launched their long-expected offensive, they would inevitably outrun their supplies. The farther they advanced, the weaker they would become, and the stronger the Allies, supported by overwhelming air superiority, could grow. This was a profound shift from earlier British experience in Burma, where static defense and slow response had allowed Japan to dominate the battlefield. The Allied strategy for 1944 was rooted in mobility. Imphal and its surrounding plain would serve as a defensive bastion, supplied entirely by air if necessary. The new logistics infrastructure, including the recently secured Lido Road and massive aerial operations over the hump, made Allied supply robust in a way the Japanese could not match. Air transport, once a novelty, was now a decisive weapon. Yet despite strategic preparation, there was still a sense of unease among the Allied ranks. Many remembered the humiliating retreat from Burma in 1942. Even with new equipment, improved morale, and superior intelligence, facing the Japanese in close combat remained a daunting prospect. As 1944 dawned, British and Indian units dug in across Manipur, not realizing they were standing on the threshold of one of the greatest battles ever fought on the Indian frontier. The storm was coming, and both sides prepared in their own way, one with material strength, the other with a belief in spiritual valor. In Tokyo, the mood was both anxious and defiant. The Japanese high command wanted results, victories that could change the narrative of a worsening war. Mutaguchi promised exactly that. In briefings, he painted India as the weak link in the Allied chain. If Imphal could be seized, he argued, the British Empire would face a political earthquake. The Indian National Army, under Subhas Chandra Bose, aligned with Japan, added a layer of political intrigue to the military campaign. Though the INA lacked the strength to spearhead major operations, their presence offered Japan a psychological weapon. Japan believed that Indian defection or rebellion might erupt if British rule appeared on the brink of collapse. In truth, these expectations were wildly optimistic. Most Indians serving in the British Indian Army were loyal, well-trained, and increasingly motivated by the desire to liberate Southeast Asia from Japanese occupation. But the Japanese were blinded by their own narratives. Mutaguchi's insistence on launching Operation Ugo was reinforced by a culture that valued offensive spirit over logistical realism. Dissenting officers were ignored or sidelined. Concerns about disease, malnutrition, and battlefield fatigue were dismissed. Japan, Mutaguchi believed, had no choice but to strike. Waiting meant certain stagnation and defeat. So the plans moved forward. 3 divisions, the 15th, 31st, and 33rd, were to spearhead the attack. Their objectives were ambitious: destroy British formations around Imphal, seize supply depots, and thrust north toward Dimapur. From there, the Japanese hoped to isolate the entire northeast frontier. It was a breathtaking vision, but one built on flawed assumptions and heroic overconfidence. The Japanese soldiers, many veterans of years of hard jungle fighting, had no illusions. They knew the march ahead would test the limits of human endurance, but they marched anyway, disciplined and determined. The road to Imphal was no longer just a plan. It was a commitment sealed in sweat, resolve, and a belief in destiny, even if destiny offered no guarantee of victory. The Japanese advance toward Imphal accelerated in March 1944 with a pace that surprised even some Allied commanders. What had begun as a dispersed movement through the dense Burmese jungle now coalesced into a series of coordinated thrusts aimed at encircling the Allied forces. Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi's three-division offensive stretched across hundreds of miles, converging like tightening jaws around Imphal Plain. Each division had a distinct but interconnected objective. The 33rd Division was to push from the south through Tidam, the 15th Division from the east via Tamu, and the 31st Division farther north toward Kohima. Together, these forces sought to trap the British Fourth Corps, cut their lines of retreat, and isolate Imphal entirely. Yet beneath this audacity lay a dangerous vulnerability. The Japanese were advancing far ahead of their supply lines, forced to rely increasingly on what they could carry or seize. Even so, their experience in earlier campaigns, where rapid encirclement had shattered Allied forces, gave them confidence. This time, however, their enemy was better trained, better supplied, and far more familiar with Japanese tactics. Still, the early momentum of the Japanese attack was undeniable. Outposts crumbled under the weight of sudden assaults. Patrols reported heavy movement along the frontier trails. The British Indian units stationed ahead of Imphal found themselves gradually withdrawing toward defensive positions. What the Allies did not yet fully grasp was the scale of the operation unfolding around them. The Japanese were not simply probing, they were preparing to envelop them completely. Encirclement was not a possibility, it was the very heart of Mutaguchi's design. And as Japanese columns pushed deeper into Manipur, the ring around Imphal began to tighten. The encirclement strategy depended on speed, secrecy, and complete conviction in the offensive spirit of the Japanese soldier. The terrain itself played a decisive role. Dense jungle canopy concealed movement, allowing entire regiments to advance undetected until they were nearly upon Allied positions. The twisting mountain paths provided natural choke points, which the Japanese used to their advantage, cutting roads and ambushing convoys. Communication lines were attacked relentlessly. One of Mutaguchi's primary goals was to sever the main road between Imphal and Kohima, an artery that was essential for Allied reinforcement and supply. If this lifeline could be cut, the British Fourth Corps would be trapped in the valley with no ground route for escape. The Japanese 31st Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, moved swiftly toward this objective. Their task was bold: push through harsh terrain, isolate Kohima, and simultaneously contribute to the wider encirclement. Yet, even as they advanced, friction began to surface. Sato himself doubted Mutaguchi's entire operational vision, believing it to be logistically impossible. But orders were orders, and his men marched northward. Meanwhile, the 15th Division advanced toward Tamu, hoping to crush the Indian 17th Division and clear the eastern approach. For the Allies stationed along these fronts, the first signs of encirclement came in the form of disappearing patrols, sudden bursts of gunfire from unexpected directions, and reports of enemy units appearing where none had been expected. It soon became clear that the Japanese were not pushing in a single direction, they were closing in from all sides. What had been the frontier of India was fast becoming the epicenter of a massive tightening noose pulled by an army convinced of its destiny. The encirclement was no longer theoretical, it was unfolding in real time, and every mile the Japanese advanced brought the Allies closer to being cut off entirely. Inside Imphal, the atmosphere shifted rapidly from cautious vigilance to controlled urgency. General Jeffrey Schoons, commanding 4th Corps, recognized the strategic danger presented by Japanese envelopment. Unlike earlier campaigns, however, the Allies were prepared. Imphal had been designated a major logistical center, with large stockpiles of ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies. Crucially, Allied air superiority meant that even if ground routes were cut, supplies could be flown in indefinitely, something the Japanese grossly underestimated. Still, the situation was precarious. If the Japanese seized the surrounding heights, Imphal itself could fall under direct artillery fire. More dangerously, the troops fighting on the outer defensive arcs could be overwhelmed before reinforcements arrived. Units such as the Indian 20th and 17th Divisions fought desperate rear-guard actions as they fell back toward the plain. Their withdrawals were not signs of collapse, but calculated moves to avoid encirclement. Yet these maneuvers came with heavy cost. Small units were cut off, supply convoys vanished into the jungle, ambulances were abandoned during hasty retreats. Many soldiers described the retreat toward Imphal as moving through a forest that felt alive with enemy presence. Japanese scouts, ambushers, and snipers lurking in every shadow. The psychological effect was immense. Even seasoned troops found themselves glancing nervously over their shoulders. But discipline held. The Allies regrouped, tightened their lines, and prepared for the onslaught. What gave them confidence was the knowledge that they were no longer the disorganized, poorly supplied army that had fled Burma 2 years earlier. This time they had air support, strong leadership, and fortified positions. If the Japanese wanted Imphal, they would have to encircle it completely and then break through a well-prepared defense that was ready to fight for every inch of ground. By late March, the encirclement became brutally apparent. The Tidam Road to the south, one of the main routes connecting Allied units to Imphal, came under relentless pressure from the Japanese 33rd Division. The road twisted along narrow mountain ridges, allowing the Japanese to establish ambush positions where a single machine gun could halt an entire convoy. The Indian 17th Division, under Major General David Cohen, found itself in a running battle, fighting to stay ahead of the Japanese forces. Cohen's men conducted a fighting withdrawal, burning supplies they could not carry and demolishing bridges as they retreated. Their situation grew increasingly dire as Japanese roadblocks sprang up behind them, threatening to encircle the division entirely. In what became known as the Battle of the Admin Box on a broader scale, the Allies relied heavily on airdrops to sustain their retreating columns. Supplies parachuted from Dakota aircraft often landed dangerously close to Japanese positions, but they kept the division alive. This ability to fight while moving backward, while still maintaining organization, was a testament to the transformation of the British Indian Army. Meanwhile, the Japanese pressure in the east intensified. At Chenam Saddle, one of the most critical mountain passes leading into Imphal, Allied defenders faced wave after wave of assaults. The fighting was fierce, often descending into brutal close combat. Yet despite heavy casualties, they held the heights. Every Japanese advance came at a steep cost in lives. But the Japanese did not relent. Mutaguchi pushed his divisions harder, convinced that the encirclement was within reach. The ring around Imphal narrowed with each passing day. Ground routes were nearly severed. Allied commanders prepared for the worst-case scenario, a complete siege. But they knew something the Japanese had failed to account for. Imphal was not an isolated outpost, it was the center of a massive air bridge. As long as the skies belonged to the Allies, the encirclement could not be complete. The battle for Imphal was no longer just on the ground, it was in the air, where aircraft carried the lifeblood of Empire divisions. The fighting that erupted across the hills surrounding Imphal reached an intensity few soldiers had ever experienced. The steep ridges, narrow passes, and dense jungle terrain turned every engagement into a brutal, close-quarters battle. The Japanese, determined to break through the Allied defensive ring, launched repeated assaults on key positions, such as Nungshigam, Sangmai, and the Shenam Saddle. These locations towered over the Imphal plain, and whoever held them controlled the approaches into the valley. The Japanese infantry, seasoned from years of jungle warfare, scaled near vertical slopes with astonishing speed, often reaching the crest before defenders realized what was happening. Their tactics relied on infiltration, night attacks, and sudden bayonet charges. But the Allies had learned. They dug deep trenches, established overlapping fields of fire, and positioned their artillery to cover the high ground with devastating precision. The clash between these two forces created a nightmare landscape where every tree conceivably hid a sniper, every ridge masked an enemy platoon, and every night brought the threat of hand-to-hand combat. This was not a battle of maneuver. It was a battle of raw endurance. The hills burned with explosions, filled with the screams of wounded men and the relentless rumble of artillery. Here, on these unforgiving heights, the fate of the Imphal campaign would be decided. Among the most iconic struggles of this phase was the battle for Nungshigam Ridge, a jagged crest that loomed over the Imphal plain and threatened the Allied 4th Corps headquarters. Japanese forces seized the ridge in a daring assault, using the cover of terrain to overrun forward positions. From the summit, they brought heavy machine guns and mountain artillery to bear on the valley below, forcing Allied units to reposition and disrupting communications. Retaking Nungshigam became an urgent priority. The task fell to the Indian 5th Division, supported by armor, a rare and risky decision given the near-vertical climb required. Churchill tanks, massive steel beasts designed for European fields, were never intended for mountain warfare. Yet Allied engineers carved narrow paths across the slopes, allowing the tanks to inch upward under heavy fire. The Japanese watched in disbelief as these armored vehicles clawed their way up the ridge. The battle that followed was ferocious. Machine gun nests had to be neutralized one by one, often through close combat. Mortar rounds rained down relentlessly. But the tanks provided a psychological and tactical edge, breaking Japanese lines that had seemed impregnable. When the ridge finally fell back into Allied hands, it became a symbol of the evolving nature of the Burma campaign. Ingenuity, combined arms coordination, and unyielding determination were overcoming the Japanese mastery of jungle terrain. The victory at Nungshigam marked a turning point, but it was only one bloody step in a series of grueling engagements across the hills. Farther south, the battle for the Shenam Saddle unfolded with equal brutality. This narrow pass, perched thousands of feet above sea level, served as the gateway into the Imphal plain from the east. If the Japanese broke through here, they would be able to pour into the valley and overwhelm Allied defenses. Recognizing its strategic importance, both sides committed some of their finest units. The Japanese launched relentless assaults, sometimes advancing through forests so dense that daylight barely penetrated the canopy. Allied defenders, including the Indian 20th Division and British battalions, endured artillery barrages, sniper fire, and waves of infantry attacks. The fighting often came down to grenade duels and bayonet charges on muddy slopes where footing was treacherous and visibility limited. Rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Wounded soldiers slid down slopes, their cries drowned by the constant roar of gunfire. Yet despite overwhelming pressure, the defenders held. Their positions were reinforced daily through hazardous supply missions flown overhead, while medium artillery batteries fired constantly to break Japanese concentration points. The Japanese, already suffering from hunger and exhaustion, found their strength draining with each failed assault. Shenam Saddle became a graveyard for battalions that had once marched confidently toward India, but now found themselves fighting for survival against foes who refused to yield. Holding the saddle kept the Japanese from breaching the eastern defenses of Imphal, and as April faded into May, it became clear that the decisive breakthrough Mutaguchi envisioned would never come from this direction. In the north, the situation intensified around the route to Kohima, where another decisive battle raged simultaneously. While not directly inside the Imphal perimeter, the fighting here had a profound effect on the Japanese ability to reinforce and coordinate their assaults. The Japanese 31st Division, tasked with capturing Kohima and cutting the road to Dimapur, now found itself fighting for every inch of ground. The battlefield at Kohima, especially the now famous Deputy Commissioner's bungalow and its surrounding tennis court, became one of the most bitterly contested locations of the entire war. The proximity of the two sides was astonishing. At one point, opposing trenches were separated barely the width of the tennis court. Soldiers described hearing their enemies whispering, coughing, and even crying in the darkness. The Japanese fought with extraordinary tenacity, but logistical collapse and relentless Allied airstrikes slowly eroded their strength. As Kohima held, it prevented reinforcements from reaching the Japanese units near Imphal. The noose that Japan had hoped to cinch around the Allies was now tightening around them instead. Cut off from supplies, starving, and increasingly isolated, Japanese battalions began losing cohesion. Their ability to continue the offensive at Imphal was fatally compromised by the struggle in the north, proof that the Battle of Imphal and the Battle of Kohima were two interlocking jaws of a single strategic vice that was now closing on the attackers. By late May, the hills around Imphal resembled a landscape from another world, a world carved by fire and suffering. Trees stood charred and splintered. Trenches overflowed with mud and rainwater. The air carried the stench of death, mingled with smoke and damp earth. Japanese soldiers, once driven by zeal and belief in a triumphant march into India, were now emaciated, exhausted, and running dangerously low on ammunition. Many survived on roots, leaves, or whatever they could forage. Still, they fought with desperate resolve, unwilling to retreat despite their deteriorating condition. By June 1944, the great Japanese offensive that had swept across the Burmese frontier and nearly enveloped Imphal was losing momentum. What had begun as a bold and daring push into India was now collapsing under the weight of its own impossible logistics. The Japanese soldiers who had advanced with speed and determination were now exhausted, starving, and increasingly isolated on the surrounding hills. Meanwhile, the Allies, led by General William Slim's masterful understanding of mobility and supply, grew stronger by the day. Aircraft roared across the sky in endless sorties, delivering ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and reinforcements. Imphal, far from being a trapped garrison, had become a fortress sustained entirely by air. With the Japanese offensive stalled, Slim knew the moment had come to seize the initiative. Breaking the siege would require not just holding the defensive lines, but launching coordinated counterattacks designed to push the Japanese back along the very routes they had taken in their advance. The coming operations would be grueling. The hills were still heavily defended. Japanese troops, though weakened, remained skilled and tenacious fighters, but the strategic tide had already turned. The Allies no longer fought for survival. They fought to end the siege once and for all, to drive the invaders back into Burma, and to crush the Japanese forces before they could escape. The counteroffensive that followed would be remembered as one of the most remarkable turnarounds in the history of the Burma campaign, a demonstration of how resilience, air power, and superior logistics could overcome even the fiercest enemy resistance. The Allied plan began with a series of meticulously coordinated assaults to retake the high ground that had hemmed in Imphal for nearly 3 months. These ridges, names like Nunchigam, Moten, and Ningtha Kong, were more than just geographical features. They were the pillars of the Japanese siege. As long as the Japanese held them, they could threaten Allied positions and prevent a breakout. Slim ordered fresh troops from the 5th and 20th Divisions to begin clearing these strategic points. The attacks were preceded by relentless artillery bombardments. Allied guns, well supplied and accurately coordinated, hammered Japanese bunkers and trenches. Japanese soldiers had little ammunition to return fire and no supplies to fortify their positions. In many cases, they fought with makeshift explosives, bayonets, or salvaged Allied weapons. Infantry units advanced carefully, clearing bunkers one by one in ferocious close-range combat. Grenade duels erupted among shattered rocks. Flamethrowers were deployed against fortified caves. The Japanese, weakened by weeks of starvation, fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant almost certain death. Yet the Allies advanced steadily, their momentum supported by constant streams of supplies delivered from the air. Each captured ridge loosened the enemy's grip on Imphal a little more. It was not a swift process. Every foot of ground was won with blood and courage, but it was a relentless one. For the first time since the offensive began, it was the Japanese who were being driven backward, their perimeter shrinking with each passing day. One of the most dramatic breakthroughs came along the Tiddim Road, where the Indian 17th Division, exhausted but newly reinforced, launched a major push to regain the route they had been forced to abandon during the Japanese advance. The terrain along this road was some of the harshest in the entire theater of war. Steep ascents, narrow defiles, and dense jungle that limited visibility to mere yards. The Japanese had fortified key points along the route and prepared ambushes designed to inflict maximum casualties. But the 17th Division had learned much since their grueling withdrawal months earlier. Supported by armored units and air cover, they advanced in methodical waves. Fighter bombers strafed Japanese positions. Artillery hammered choke points. Engineers cleared booby traps and repaired damaged pathways. The Japanese defenders, already weakened by hunger and disease, found themselves unable to withstand the sustained pressure. In many instances, they attempted counterattacks but lacked the strength to break Allied lines. The Tiddim Road slowly reopened, mile by mile. This was more than a tactical success, it was a psychological victory. Reopening this route meant restoring a key artery of movement, allowing the Allies to push deeper into the hills and dislodge the Japanese entirely. It also signaled that the Japanese grip on the region was unraveling. What had once been a menacing advance toward the heart of Imphal was now reversing into a desperate Japanese retreat laden with suffering and loss. While the southern and eastern fronts saw heavy combat, the most decisive shift emerged in the north, where the road between Imphal and Kohima, the lifeline for Allied reinforcement, was finally nearing full reopening. For months, Japanese forces had maintained control of key positions along this vital axis, preventing ground convoys from passing. The battle for Kohima, fought with astonishing ferocity, had already turned in the Allies' favor. Now fresh British and Indian units pushed southward along the Dimapur-Kohima-Imphal road, engaging weakened Japanese elements who could no longer sustain their positions. The terrain here was equally difficult, with thick forests and steep ridges. But Allied forces, emboldened by victory at Kohima, advanced with growing confidence. The Japanese 31st Division, once tasked with driving all the way into Assam, was now reduced to fragmented units fighting to survive. Their commander, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, openly disregarded Mutaguchi's orders to continue offensive operations, instead focusing on saving what remained of his division. As the Japanese fell back, Allied engineers repaired bridges, cleared debris, and marked safe passages for convoys. On June 22, 1944, the moment that symbolized the collapse of the Japanese siege finally arrived. Allied spearheads from Imphal met advancing units from Kohima at milestone 109. The road, closed for months by Japanese encirclement, was open once again. Imphal was no longer besieged. The psychological weight of the siege lifted instantly, replaced by a renewed determination to press the advantage. The Japanese, their offensive in ruins, now faced the grim prospect of retreat through the same deadly terrain that had weakened them beyond recovery. The Battle of Imphal ended not with a dramatic final stand, but with a slow, agonizing unraveling of the Japanese 15th Army. By July 1944, the once ambitious Operation U-Go had collapsed completely, leaving behind a trail of devastation unmatched in the history of the Japanese Army. The divisions that had marched proudly into the jungles of Manipur were no longer coherent fighting forces, but shattered remnants struggling to escape annihilation. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion had claimed more lives than Allied bullets. The retreat across the Indo-Burmese frontier became one of the most tragic episodes of the entire Burma campaign. Soldiers staggered through mud-filled tracks, often with no boots, no food, and no medical supplies. Many carried wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers until they collapsed themselves. The monsoon rains turned every stream into a torrent, drowning stragglers and washing away supply caches. Those who attempted to cross the Chindwin River often drowned or died waiting for makeshift rafts. Japanese officers struggled to impose discipline, but their men were beyond the limits of human endurance. What had begun as an invasion meant to shatter British power in Asia had instead broken the Japanese army itself. The scale of the disaster shocked even Tokyo. Of the roughly 85,000 Japanese troops committed to the Imphal-Kohima offensive, nearly half were dead, and most of the survivors were physically ruined. Never again would Japan mount a major strategic offensive on the Asian mainland. The defeat at Imphal was not simply a battlefield failure. It was a turning point that marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion in South and Southeast Asia. The immediate military consequences of the defeat were profound. With the Japanese divisions crippled, the Allied 14th Army seized the opportunity to launch its own major offensive. Under Slim's leadership, the Allies crossed the Chindwin River and advanced into central Burma, reclaiming town after town from Japanese control. The Japanese, weakened beyond recovery, were forced into a long, desperate defensive struggle. Their logistical network was broken. They no longer had the supplies to sustain prolonged resistance. Imphal had drained their strength so severely that even well-prepared defensive positions in Burma crumbled under Allied pressure. The once feared Japanese army, renowned for its rapid advances in the early years of the war, was now a shadow of its former self. The loss of experienced officers, veteran non-commissioned leaders, and irreplaceable infantry left gaps that could not be filled. Many Japanese battalions existed only on paper. Reinforcements sent from other theaters arrived too late or were themselves weakened by supply shortages. The defeat fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Burma theater. For the first time since 1942, the Allies no longer feared a Japanese counterstroke. Instead, they had the freedom to conduct aggressive, large-scale operations that pushed relentlessly toward Rangoon. The road to eventual victory in Burma and the liberation of Southeast Asia began with the destruction of the Japanese offensive at Imphal. The psychological impact of the defeat was equally significant. Japanese soldiers and officers had long believed in the invincibility of their military spirit, an ethos that emphasized courage, sacrifice, and offensive action as the keys to victory. Mutaguchi's plan had relied heavily on this belief, assuming that moral superiority would compensate for logistical weakness. But Imphal revealed the harsh truth. Bravery alone could not sustain an army cut off from supplies, starving, and facing a well-prepared enemy with overwhelming air superiority. Survivors returned to Burma not as conquering heroes, but as hollow-eyed men who had endured the unendurable. Many suffered from severe malnutrition, jungle diseases, and psychological trauma. Their accounts of the retreat, men collapsing on the trail, officers unable to command, entire units dissolving into chaos, shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. For the Japanese command, the defeat was difficult to accept. Mutaguchi was eventually relieved of his command, his reputation forever tainted by the catastrophic losses his ambition had caused. His superiors in Tokyo distanced themselves from the operation, even though they had approved it. Within the Japanese military establishment, Imphal became a painful lesson in the consequences of ignoring logistical reality. The aura of unstoppable Japanese infantry, forged in earlier successes across Asia, was gone. The Allies, once intimidated by Japanese tactics, now recognized their weaknesses clearly. Imphal had broken not just divisions, it had broken the psychological foundation upon which much of Japan's early war success had been built. For the Allies, the aftermath of Imphal was marked by a mixture of relief, pride, and renewed determination. Soldiers who had endured the siege reflected on the extraordinary transformation their armies had undergone since the early days of the war. British, Indian, and African troops had fought side by side in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Their victory was a testament to improved training, better leadership, superior logistics, and the increasing coordination between air and ground forces. The Royal Air Force and the American Air Transport Command had been decisive. Without the constant airlift of supplies, Imphal would almost certainly have fallen. Instead, air power turned the besieged valley into an impregnable fortress and ensured that Allied troops could launch counterattacks from a position of strength. The victory also strengthened the morale of the Indian Army, which had grown into a massive and capable fighting force. Indian divisions proved their effectiveness repeatedly during the battle, and their success helped reshape perceptions within the British military establishment. The unity shown among the diverse Allied forces in the Imphal-Kohima campaign demonstrated a new level of professionalism and adaptation. The soldiers who fought there carried forward a sense of confidence that would sustain them in the long, difficult push toward Rangoon and beyond. Imphal was more than a defensive triumph. It was a symbol of resilience, cooperation, and the emergence of a modern, highly capable Allied force in the East. On a broader geopolitical level, the defeat at Imphal had lasting repercussions for Japan's position in Asia. The hoped-for uprising within India never materialized. Indian troops remained loyal to the Allied cause, and Japanese attempts to coordinate with the Indian National Army yielded little strategic benefit. Instead of sparking rebellion, the invasion reinforced the determination of Allied India to resist Axis expansion. The collapse of the Japanese offensive also weakened their ability to supply and coordinate operations in China and Southeast Asia. With their armies overstretched and encircled, Japanese commanders were forced into an increasingly defensive posture across the region.